Yes, I identify myself as an Afro-Italian, and because of when I'm much more than just Senegalese. I'm just much more than just like an Ethiopian, like Italian, and also the way like to reconnect with the wider like African diaspora in Italy and the rest of the world. I think using Afro and with Italian, I think it's a way for me, to connect with people that share that type of like experience, identity. Although there are dark skin like Habesha, I think what people understand as with the term is mainly like light skinned people from that type, from that part of the world.
So right off the bat, skin color is something that you brought to the forefront.
Yeah.
So let's talk about kind of like what this Habesha look means, how you learned what the look is. Does your mom match that stereotypical look? What was your experience like growing up? Just kind of like the identity formation of what Habesha is.
My mom like marrying like an African, a non-Ethiopian African person was very like uncommon, particularly at that period of time, like in the 90s. My father is not even Christian; he's Muslim.
She's Christian?
She's Christian, Orthodox Christian, while he's Muslim.
How did you feel like you related to Ethiopia? Like you were saying how you felt disconnected because you didn't grow up around many people, but like were you learning Amharic or Tigray at all? Were you eating the food? Were you learning the customs?
Yeah, the thing, I had like so many like pieces. Of course, like just having like my mom around is already like a lot, but I remember like having friends asking, hey, please tell your mom like to cook injera, zigini, and that her economic situation, the fact that she's a domestic worker, and so many of her friends, including her sister, were doing the same type of job, also made me curious, not just about, of course, like the work that they were doing, but also like why they were doing it, like why they were all like illiterate, like I didn't know like why she would go like to sleep always like very early, and then like after like visiting like Tigray, and the fact that so many like rely just on like sunlight, which makes people wake up like very early but also like go to sleep like very early, made me understand like so many like things about her. But I wish she went to school and she learned about like history, about like why, about the fact that if she didn't go to school, it was not necessarily her parents' like decision, but actually like a systematic like way of subjugating like people. And unfortunately, it was very difficult for me to like learn the language because my parents like spoke initially like Arabic among each other when I was like very young, because they were like coming from Libya. And then because I didn't have like any like language like in common, like except from those. So, and then they spoke basically Italian for the rest of their life. Like sometimes like she has really like trauma from like poverty. Like growing up really like with nothing, and like seeing images of war and now, and remembering like what was happening like back in the late 70s.
So then growing up, like you didn't know the word Habesha. Like how were you taught to identify as Ethiopian, as Tigrayan? Like what was that?
I grew up like identifying as Ethiopian. Understanding of Habesha came much later.
Do you remember the first time you heard it?
Either like in late high school or like university, when I was studying I think when I was studying Arabic, because I think I studied like Arabic, did some courses on like the history of Islam, and I was curious to I found like this figure of Bilal. Is one of like the followers of like Muhammad. Was a slave. Was one of like the first like converters like to Islam, and was called like Bilal al-Habashi because he was from where like Habesha people like originate, which is like North Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I think the roots are like Semitic, and that Ge'ez was like a Semitic language. I only found out about that when I was at university. There were so many like sounds I grew up like hearing, which made me think, oh, this is like so similar like to Arabic, or like why is my mom so good at like speaking Arabic while she struggled so much like with Italian. Mm-hmm. And then I started like to connect the dots, like they come from like the same roots, same family.
It sounds like you've studied the word a lot, so you learned it from like an academic perspective.
As well, yeah. Like I heard it before, because I studied like Arabic. The etymology is like a bit contested. Some say it's not good. It's from other like languages that were like spoken in or around the region. I listened a lot, like I heard a lot growing up is the word Abyssinia because of the connection with the Italian Empire. Of course, colonized Eritrea, occupied like Ethiopia, and I grew up like listening a lot of like fascist like songs. Basically, the Italians are like encouraged like to go to like East Africa and liberate faccette nere, like black faces, which in this case are Habesha women. And one of the propaganda was...
Wait, this is like something you heard growing up?
Of course.
What? No. This is not of course. You're teaching us, our community, something. This is crazy.
I know the song as well. It's so crazy. I mean, I learned first like Abyssinia.
Yes, Abyssinia through the songs.
Abyssinia, absolutely, like through the songs, through like history. But then...
so the Italians would sing about Abyssinia?
Yeah. Faccetta nera della Abyssinia. Oh my god, I shouldn't sing this. Because I grew up like, and the thing is, it's so bad because they were like people of my age, and they probably like learned that song from their parents, and their parents were probably like fascists. And I have so many friends that sometimes like you start conversation and they're like, my my grandfather was there, he was working as blah blah blah. Yeah. My family got rich when my grandfather like went to Libya. So there were like a lot of like incentives like for Italians, particularly for like poor Italians, like to go to East Africa, get jobs, and one of like the incentives, this promise of you can have as many like women as you want, beautiful Habesha like women. Through that narrative, I also like understood why. Sorry, I lost myself.
No, that was interesting. I think you're talking a lot about like the Afro-Italian experience, which I do not know much about. So this was really informative.
Yeah.
So like, growing up, would you say you were like very proudly both Ethiopian and Senegalese?
Yes, always very proud about that. But I grew up like being surrounded and knowing much more about Senegalese culture than Ethiopian one. The Habesha youth is only like later in my life, and now I feel like I'm very much like closer to them, particularly here in the diaspora. Maybe also as a way for me like to catch up with what I missed growing up, but also as a way to cope with more dramatic situations that affected my family, basically.
What is it like to grow up having Ethiopian heritage in Italy?
I felt like a sense of like gratitude, like to Italy growing up, which totally like changed after I found out about like my Habesha like heritage, and about how much more my parents, my mom like gave to them compared to what like she got back. The cool thing was that there were no like African restaurants except Habesha restaurants. Initially, I didn't know exactly why they were like exclusively like those restaurants. But then the more I learned about like the history, the more I learned about like the Italian presence like in East Africa, I understood that this totally makes sense. I found very funny how like my mom could pronounce like certain like Italian words like perfectly, almost perfectly, because they were like present in the Tigrinya language and sometimes even in Amarinya. And you know, I didn't understand, like, you know, there were like specific words like lenzuola or armadio, caramella, lampadina, and I only like learned that they were like the same in Tigrinya when I visited. You feel it even more, like the presence, even the way like some roads are like shaped, how like they pave. You know, for example, like Mekelle, it has very much, or like some parts of Aksum, like it very much like reminds of how like Romans back in the days used to pave. How much they love lasagna, and how much like Italians like love like injera.
So then, when did you start identifying as Habesha or using that as a self-descriptor?
Later at university, I think, particularly when I was in London, and I moved to London recently after my first travel to Ethiopia, which totally changed my understanding of like Habesha. I thought that the Ethiopians were all like light-skinned or like looking like my mom or people from the north of the country, while it's actually much more like diverse. And not everyone is Habesha, and sometimes it has been used as a way like to like normalize the fact, you know, like people from the north are the ones that have like the custody of the country, or the ones that have historically like ruled the country, and they should be like called as such, while it's a country that has gone through like so many wars and characteristics that are of what it means to be Habesha. Like, for example, we could say like Amharic, how it has been used as a way like to colonize like the rest of the country.
Can you describe like more explicitly that development from describing yourself as Habesha as a community builder to understanding it as exclusive? Like, can you give very specific?
Yeah, absolutely. So so when it will be like a struggle, because I want to identify as such, and I do identify myself as such, but at the same time, like, I am not comfortable with many of the characteristics that dominate what it means to be like a Habesha. Like the fact that you know, usually Orthodox Christianism is seen as like a denominator, or you know, like being like light-skinned, but the fact that the majority like associate like those specific characteristics to what it means to be Habesha, sometimes like makes me feel like I'm uncomfortable. Being asked so many times, "Oh, you're Habesha, but why are you so dark?" You know, and when I have like family members that are 100% like Habesha, they are as dark as me or even darker than me, and it almost seems as you are like an exception. For me, like, identity has always been like very, very fluid. And there are times in which I consider myself Habesha, other in which I don't prefer like using the term, and it very much like changes according to the environment, person. But at the same time, I don't exclude myself from the group.
Can you talk about religion? You mentioned your mom is Christian, your dad's Muslim. What religion were you raised with?
Yeah.
And how have you come to the conclusion that like the Habesha identity is like very strongly affiliated with the church?
So my mom is Orthodox Christian, and my dad is Muslim. And being born and raised in Italy, I went to a school like run by the nuns, like Catholic. Like now, so I grew up in a very Catholic like environment. My mom really like wanted me to assimilate with Italian culture, so I got baptized, I did the communion, but I've never been that religious. I've always been like exposed to so many like influences. I believe in God, I believe in something much bigger than me, but I'm not very like religious. And also like what's interesting here is how much diaspora like kids grew up like in the church, like going like regularly. Like here in the US, it's easier like to make community, while in Italy is incredibly complicated. There is still only like one Orthodox Coptic church in Rome, in the city center. Yes, my mom is of that type of religion, but she always found it to be like too far from where we used to live, so she didn't go to that church for like over like a decade. I would have probably known more because it's such a crucial aspect of the identity, of the shared understanding of what it means to be Habesha, that probably having it in my life earlier like would have like allowed me like to know more. And I still don't know, I think, like enough.
The church.
About the church, yeah, the Coptic church. If you ask me anything about like Catholicism, I can speak for hours about it. Like I don't know if calling it like erasure, but you know, this diversity is not exposed as it should be. Even the fact that half of the Eritrean population is Muslim, it's something I had no idea.
So then you also mentioned earlier that when you like talk about your identity with outsiders, you would say Habesha, but if you see someone from the region, you would like specifically ask them where they're from.
Yes. It depends, like the fact that my mom is a Tigrayan. Before the war was not really like a thing. I know, yeah, Tigray was there, that, yeah, my mom is a native like Tigranian speaker, and she speaks Amharic too, and she's always been a pro-Ethiopia and very like nationalist. But after the war, I like Tigrayanness took over any other type of identity from that region. It's hard today like to identify as an Ethiopian or as an Habesha. I know we have to like move on, but it's not easy. It's really hard. If someone from outside asks me, okay, are you Habesha? Yes, I am. But if they have to ask me, okay, what are you? I'm from Tigray, I'm from the northern Ethiopia. And it's so interesting because, you know, I have no problem with identifying myself with being Senegalese. Yes, of course, even like within Senegalese community, there are so many different identities. Fulani, which is actually a group that originates like in Ethiopia and that is spread across the entire Sahel.
So growing up in Italy and through your travels, I would love to hear how people have responded to you as you've identified with Habesha. You've talked a little bit about how colorism plays a role in it, but would love to hear just like how people's reactions have been to your Ethiopian identity, Habesha identity, both other Habesha people but also other Africans.
Reactions have been so like different. I could literally pass for a Somali, someone from Gambela, Tigray as well. If you see like my uncle, like we really like literally like look like the same. People always think that I'm from East Africa, and you know there is always like a big surprise when they found out, oh, you're actually from both parts of like the continent, from East and West. You know, like in Senegal, they're always like, oh, you look like from Djibouti. They say Djibouti because it was like another like French-speaking like colony, and that's what they know most or better about like East Africa. Yeah, they know like Ethiopia, but the francophonie like plays a role in the way it helped them. Almost never I heard like Eritrean, because for many people still Eritrea is part of like Ethiopia, or like they are the same.
How do you feel about that as a Tigrayan? The whole Eritrea and Ethiopia are the same.
The Eritrean?
Like when you hear people say that, how do you feel?
I hate when people, you know, I had like a colleague at work one time was like, you know, they're Eritrean, but that used to be part of our land, of Ethiopia, you know? And it comes from like a very like imperialist like point of view. To be fair, like I hang out like, with a lot of like Eritreans. You know, they fought for that. I'm just sad about like how things then ended up like developing like in the country. But I've never been against like Eritrean like independence. But I'm just very very sad to see how people think of us as being so different. Well, actually, we're so like similar, and what divides us, it's very like little compared to what actually like, keeps us, like unites us. And I don't know where that comes from. That comes from a very, as I said, like imperialist way of thinking, which I hate, because my family has gone through the same type of struggle that Eritrea has gone through in the 70s, in the 80s. They fought together like alone. Then political decisions were made, but I've always been like very like respectful of what people. I just hope there wouldn't be such tensions. I would hope that would be like economic exchanges of goods and free borders. I have so many family members that like were born there and that like relocated.
In Eritrea?
Yeah, like in Mandefera, my uncle, like my auntie is from there, or that went like to school like in Asmara. It's literally, and my mom is from Aksum, which is only like few kilometers away from the border. I struggle to understand how close we were, how people like used to like move back and forth back in the day, and now they can't, or if they do, they have to like risk their lives. It's so sad, The community in Senegal has also been like split between like Mauritania and Senegal. And my father's village is very close to the border with Mauritania, but we don't have this type of like tensions, and it makes me so sad actually. And like the hatred that there is sometimes in between like the two territories.
Specifically Tigray and Eritrea?
Yeah. Because they are the ones that I'm much closer to and that I know like best.
Well, can you talk about how like we just talked about how the Habesha identity is like factually like the Highlanders, like this region, the people. Because I know there are also Tigrayans talking about how they no longer identify as Habesha. So how. And I mean, I know this is like very fluid, and I'm sure Tigrayans are still figuring it out, like independently and collectively. But how, like, what is your reaction to the word Habesha now, and like, what does that symbolize to you now versus before the war?
Like before the war, I think the way I understood Habesha was like we have so many different like groups. Like within like the Abyssinia community that understand each other, like live together. There are like some political like differences, very little in terms of like culture. I think maybe like language and religion to a certain extent. But after like the war like started, as an insider, as someone that is part that can fall under like that category, it's a struggle like to keep identifying yourself with other people that have like actively tried to kill your family members, or justified way of like acting, basically justifying like a genocide. And I would have never like expected like something like that, and I've been so disappointed by the diaspora, not just like people living in Ethiopia, Eritrea, but a lot by the diaspora. As a Tigrayan, I think we're still like figuring out, our space within the Ethiopian state. Because I think it's the more like likely like scenario and easier, I think, for even Tigray like itself. But it's disheartening, it's hard, and I think in the diaspora we are much less keen on like forgiving or like move over, while people back home have sort of, I think they've moved on like much more quickly than people in the diaspora. I think, for my most recent trip,
which was when?
It was in July. I was in both in Addis. I went to Mekelle, to Aksum, and people were more. It seems that nothing happened. It shouldn't be as such. Of course, there are like feelings, but I think people have moved on in a much quicker way. And sometimes, like, it reminds me, like the dynamics of it's much different. But what's happening now in like with the Eritrean communities across the world, how much the older generation who fought like strongly like support the government, while the youth who recently like moved to the west, how much against they are against like the government. the dynamics are so interesting to see, and I don't know what's gonna happen with the Tigrayan community. I think we'll be for like a long time with a very angry diaspora that lives through the war, that witness the war from outside, and I'm curious to see how people that will move here after witnessing the war in Ethiopia, what their feeling will be.
So as a Tigrayan, what do you know about Eritrea and Tigray's relationship as it precedes this war?
I know like the current state of Eritrea was the first Italian colony like in East Africa, and the current borders of Eritrea with Ethiopia are the ones that were like traced by the Italians. My mom, a lot of like the friends she had were from Eritrea. Like politics has never been like an issue among them. I remember it was one when I was like about like 6 or 7 years old. I had like an Eritrean friend who's still one of my best friends today, called Samson, and he was at the peak of Ethiopia-Eritrea war of like 98, like 2000. And I remember like we were like passing, me, my brother, my mom, under Samson's house, and her mom came out of the balcony, started like to screaming, to shout at us and insulting my mom about the fact that she's Tigrayan. And initially I didn't understand. Years after, I was able like to connect the dot and ask my mom, hey, remember that day, was it because of the war? And she was like, yes. And she was really nasty, and I was surprised to see someone shouting at my mom. That was like the only moment of like tension, like in the diaspora. But the rest, similarities, with the shared history of Eritrea, Tigray, the struggle for independence, like how both like EPLF, TPLF like fought together, and the decision they took after the war was over.
What does that mean, the decision?
EPLF decided like to be secession, independence from Ethiopia when the war like ended, like a few years after. I think in 93 or 91, 93 Eritrea became like independent. While Tigray decided like to stay together with other parties in Ethiopia that decided like to form the federal government of Ethiopia, based mainly on ethnicities. There has been so much devastation, but I want to be positive about the future. I'm very hopeful about the fact that I didn't find this sentiment of like revenge or like hatred against Eritreans like among Tigrayans, because we know that like a lot of like atrocities committed during the most recent war were done by Eritrean forces, but I didn't find. I think like the population knows that even the soldiers themselves are like victims of a system that is put in place by a president that has completely like brainwashed them. And a lot of the protests that I'm seeing in the diaspora at the Eritrean festivals and beyond are giving me so much like hope about like a more positive living together. Like I really hope there won't be any tension like anymore. I'm very hopeful about this movement of resistance, these disruptions like happening. And I find it very funny that the Eritrean government is always like labeling the protesters as like Tigrayans and not like Eritreans. Maybe there might be some Tigrayans as well, but maybe those could also like be Tigrayans with ties to Eritrea because we're so like interconnected. But it's like the same like narrative of like seeing that the country has no problem, everything is good. I think the people are much more peaceful and open to cooperate and move on than the government, than the politicians like themselves. I really hope there will be a change in government in both countries, because I think it's one of like the major bottlenecks right now for like lasting peace among the two. I've never been involved in Ethiopian like politics, and I don't think I will ever be involved. I'm just for like people to live like in peace.
So then, would you say like your Tigrayan identity came to the forefront after the war?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the war that changed completely. Yeah, my self-identification.
And the word Habesha as well, like you are identifying it with less because of the cultural, but more because of like who else is associated with it.
Yes. As I said, it changed. Like, initially, I didn't know much. Then I started like to learn more. I started like to identify myself with it. I traveled to Ethiopia. I completely like changed my idea of what it means like to be like Habesha. And after like the war started, I had my doubts about like the concept in general. But now it's even more like tricky to identify as such. Though I'm part of it.
Is there anything you want to say as it relates to the Tigrayan community before we move on?
Tigrayan community, for like the longest part, or at least the first year of the war, I wasn't here in New York. I was mainly in Senegal and following everything online. And then I moved back here. I was very much like looking forward like to share like the pain, like fundraise for like family back home. And we were really love like support to each other. And I was very disappointed by the Ethiopians in general. Like the pro-war, like raising funds to support the military and all of that. Even people I play soccer with, it's so hard because you play like football sometimes and then you're like, oh shit, like this person was actually cheering for like the extermination of my family. And I had so many like family members that died. And to be fair, like I found many more like Eritreans. I shared like compassion of the cause because it's very similar to what they experienced as well, like back in the day.
Like during the border war?
No, it'd be more during the Dirt War.
Do you guys ever talk about the border war?
Do you mean me as a community?
Like you speaking with Eritrea?
With Eritrea? Almost never. And to be fair, like of all the wars that happened, is the one I know like less about it. And it sounds like a very like stupid like war that should have never happened. I think what we discuss more is, unfortunately, people from that region like witness too many wars.
It's interesting because coming from the Eritrean perspective, I think I'm not really sure how to address this. I think it's something that'll happen over time, but I think that's a big blocker for Eritreans to talk about this with Tigrayans because I think you're coming from the perspective of like, a lot more Eritreans who support Tigray. And I don't think that's been the experience of other Tigrayans I've met. They see a lot more pro-war Eritreans. And I think like it doesn't justify at all anything that's happening, but I think something that does need to be included in the conversation is the 2000s war is the reason people are supporting this. And
absolutely.
If we don't take that into the conversation, it's difficult.
Yeah. It's absolutely... I totally see it as a revenge on that war, and despite the fact that like, Eritrea like won the war, like the peace agreement that they made like in Algiers, like really like labeled Eritrea as the oppressed and Ethiopia as the oppressor, like in that case. But still, I think it wasn't enough, that peace like agreement, and that for basically almost like two decades this has been like boiling. But I also think it's so like to blame the people for that when it actually was orchestrated by politicians. Of course, they had to use the military to do that, but like the targeting of like civilians in the war is something that I will never like accept, understand.
So then going back to like our relationship to other Africans, maybe even like being informed by your time in Senegal, what are people's general like ideas of Ethiopia and Eritrea?
To be fair, like very similar to what the West has of Ethiopia, Eritrea, because they receive the same images: famine, constantly starving, very poor, fetishization of the women. So like beautiful, sexy, better, like light skin, and war, constant war. Also, the fact that they've never been, Ethiopia's never been colonized. I think it plays like a big role, like in Africa, like minds in terms of pride. But also I find like very funny how at the same time they don't necessarily like, consider themselves as like African, Ethiopians, Eritreans themselves.
Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, even in my family, there is this constant way of loving me as half Habesha, half Tigray, and African. I struggle with that because like my Africanness and my blackness is above any of this concept of like being like Habesha, because here what people see is a black person. Same in Italy, they don't see a Senegalese or like an Habesha. And unfortunately, my life has been like so much like characterized by what people see. Yeah, I never liked that, that the complex of superiority that Habesha people have, not just among Africa, but also like within Ethiopia, like itself. Even just like watching like Ethiopian like broadcasting from the outside, you think that everyone is from the north of the country, while actually it's just a minority at the end. It's more like there are like much bigger like groups, they're like much more like diverse. I hated like learning about what people of the north like did to the rest of Ethiopia, the Somali, to the people from the south, and how they are still more likely to be in position of power compared to, and then also Sudan as well has the same type of problem. So yeah, I'm very much of a Pan-Africanist.
How was it like being in Italy? And you touched on it a little bit earlier with this racist song, but if you talk about like the position that Habesha people hold in Italy, how they're perceived, if Habesha is used.
I think being Habesha in Italy for a kid is not as cool as like here, like the Habesha people like living in Italy, they're mainly or mostly in very low paid jobs, below working class. While like here in the US, the UK, you can find like you see yourself, you see people that look like you much more in either like very like normal jobs, or you can see opportunities like in Italy. They're very much in the domestic sphere, like Habesha people working mainly as domestic workers, mostly women, but to a certain extent also like men. There is a huge influx of Eritrean asylum seekers coming to Italy. One of like the biggest shipwreck. Yeah, it was like 10 years ago in 2013, over 300 Eritreans died. It caused a lot of shame, but also awareness to a certain extent about what happens in that region of the world, but it's also like automatically associated even more like poverty with the term, like Habesha.
Is the word Habesha used in Italy?
No. You may hear like Abyssinia, but when you hear like Abyssinia, it comes from like the connotation is not good, because that's how Italy like used to refer like to that part of the world like during colonialism, when it was already like called like Ethiopia then. So if you use like Abyssinia, it's really like you want to emphasize that past of the country.
So today you'll hear people call it Abyssinia.
Yeah, you could hear like Abyssinia, but it's not like a term that is used. It might have been, it was definitely used up to 56 years ago in a like general like way, because that's how people used to refer to people from that part of the world. But now you struggle like, to hear that word. Ethiopia, Eritrea, yeah.
And they're like pretty familiar with the history.
Yeah, I mean, not that much. I think like some know. Sometimes I think of like just like Ethiopia, and that Eritrea is like a region of like Ethiopia. But also like very much like depends on who you ask, how old the person is. The country is surprisingly incredibly ignorant about that part of like their history, because it was such a shameful part of like Italy's history, like fascism. They tend like completely obfuscate or like forget what it had been. And it's interesting because when Italy announced when they conquered like Eritrea, and when they arrived like in Addis and they occupied like Addis, it was like the peak of Mussolini like reinstalled the Italian Empire. Something interesting is, you know, like the obelisk like in Aksum was brought to Rome during that period. And it's such a, you know, like the obelisk is such a marker of like the Ethiopian like identity, Tigrayan identity. So I remember when I was born, during the first years of my life, the Aksum like obelisk was in Italy, like something that they took as a way of you know, like conquering like the people, subjugating the people, because that's what like Romans used to do like back in the days. They used to go like to Egypt, take obelisks from Cairo, or like columns from Greek, and bring them back to the center of the empire of Rome. And they did the same with Ethiopia. They took the obelisk, which was like the symbol of the identity of the culture, symbolizing history of that part of the world, and they brought it back to Rome. And for so many years, the Ethiopian government, they fought for years like to get like the obelisk like back, and they managed like to get it back. But you know, of course, like Italians, they know nothing like about that, and I find it so interesting, curious, fascinating, frustrating that I've always been like so close, or like my identity, like, you know, like me as a Tigrayan, Habesha, Ethiopian, being in Italy was not like a coincidence. It was just like the result of years of subjugation, not just from the Italian, but also from Imperial Ethiopia, and, you know, the illiteracy of my mom, and etc., and of so many other like Eritrean like women that came. It's all part of systematic oppression that my ancestors have been through. And I got like a cousin of mine, both parents illiterate, like my mom was able like to go to school. Now is a professor at Arbaminch University.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, and you know, like me going to top universities like in the UK, getting like a job here in New York, it's something that in a span of like a generation, it's so I sometimes wonder like how my mom would have been if she went to school, you know. It's not something we should give for granted always, you know. And unfortunately there are so many of like my mom's generation from that part of the country, Eritreans as well, that didn't have like access to it, and they fought for it. Yeah, you see the results when people have access like to education. You know.
There's also so many Habesha Italians. So like, how do you guys, interact with the media? Have there been like more efforts for representation in media and in politics?
Yeah.
What has that looked like?
There have been like a few Eritrean like actresses. Definitely one that played in Italian movies, but she was like the only one. And now more recently they are coming. And my brother is like an actor like in Italy. He's one of like the first. It's a good like historical moment to be black and Italian, because there haven't been many like in the past. But it's also like very challenging because he always has to play stereotypical role. You cannot go like just like to a random like casting. They have to like specify in the job description that they need like a black actor or like a black actress, because if he doesn't see the black written there, the assumption is that that is not for a black person, that type of role. And now he's on a show like in Italy, also playing a very stereotypical role of like a migrant that has just arrived, that doesn't speak well like Italian.
How many siblings do you have?
One, only one.
Just him?
Yeah. I'm much more connected than him. I did more of like self-learning, been to Ethiopia 3 times, he's never been. I went to Ethiopia for the first time on my own without even my mom, because of like the curiosity
Wow.
and willingness to learn more about like my heritage, my family.
Wait, can you like outline the times that you went? Like, what was the year? Your
Yeah,
age?
it was 2015. I was 22 years old. I went alone. I arrived in Addis. I thought they were like my cousin, like waiting for me at the airport. So I waited for like 2 hours there. But then I realized I didn't know that Ethiopians, Eritreans, they had a different way of. 6 a.m. is basically is like 12, and then 7 a.m. is like 1 a.m. I was alone.
What are the other two times?
2017.
Okay.
I brought my father with me, and 2023.
And your mom's never been back?
My mom has been back in 2013 time. She went together with my auntie, her sister, and then I went on my own. And you know that visit was crucial because my mom gave my names, my name, my brother's name to my cousins that are like literate and stuff. They looked for us on Facebook. We started like to exchange. 2 years after I went, during my gap, almost year, like 9 months between my undergrad and master's degree.
The whole 9 months?
No, I was there for like a month, but I traveled by road throughout the entire. When I went all the way up to Tigray, then to Gondar, Bardar, went all the way to the south to see my cousin. So I had a very full spectrum of Ethiopia during that travel. And then I went to in 2017 again with my dad because he was feeling so ashamed of not having been there since he got to know like my mom. And then I went recently because I was traveling to Rwanda for work. Because of the proximity, I asked if I could take like a personal deviation and spent like a week.
I think I got what I needed out of this.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious to see what you will take out of